Hi, it's Tibor Shanto from Access Group. Today, I have the profound privilege of one of the sales coaches, trainers that I love in the marketplace, Tibor from Rambo Sales Solutions, with me. I've been watching his content for a while. I've been following him. I've had the privilege of talking to him a few times. He's just a brilliant guy, and I love to introduce him to my network of clients and prospects, and just database, and contribute something to society by connecting some of my top leaders here in this platform with you. Tibor, thanks so much for being here with me. I know you've got over 30 years of B2B sales experience, coaching, mentoring sales executives, CEOs, like that, on how to improve their sales pipeline. I know you've got a really good list of clients like the Bell Mobilities of the world, and you also work with small size companies. You know, one of the biggest questions I think the marketplace keeps asking is, how do I keep my sales pipeline consistent? Like sometimes my sales goes up, then my sales goes down, sales goes up, sales goes down. How do I keep it consistent? What advice do you have for people?
So I think that's a great question. I do get it a lot because, again, what people are looking for is how do they have some predictability in revenue? How do they have some visibility into their pipeline that they can actually use for planning the good stuff that they want to manufacture, produce, or what have you. So I think the key, first of all, is figuring out what does your sales cycle look like, and that needs to be done on an organizational level. So what are the expectations of your customer? What is their buying experience, and how do I align my sales process to that in sort of an organizational way? But then that needs to cascade down to an individual. So I may be a better prospector than the next guy, but not as good as a presenter of concepts. So I will have a different set of metrics, and my sales cycle will look different than somebody who's maybe not a good prospector, but is really good at getting the customer to open up and so on. So I think it's important that each salesperson, just like each athlete, get to know what some of their strengths and some of their statistics are. If you ask most athletes, they'd be able to tell you what their batting average is or what their plus minus is if they're a hockey player or whatever the case is. And that allows them to then decide where they want to make improvements, changes, and so forth. So once you begin to understand what your metrics are, what your stats are at different stages of the sales cycle, and what they look like across the sales cycle, then with your manager, with your coach, it's relatively straightforward. I don't want to say it's easy, but it's relatively straightforward then to put a plan together that make sure that you're doing sufficient level of activities at each stage of the cycle to drive that level of pipeline that you need. So as an example, if I know that, let's say out of every 10 first meetings that I have, I will eventually close one deal, then I need to close 3 deals a month. And I know that I need to have 30 first meetings that month.
Right.
So I have a choice. I could work at making that 30 meetings, or I could work with my manager to say, how do I reduce, what changes do I make in my approach to sales to get that down to 9 to 1? So I could work differently, I could work smarter. So I can put an action plan into place as to how to improve my sales cycle without sacrificing it. So that allows me to have a consistent level of activity. So what happens now, people will prospect, they'll get a whole bunch of things in their pipeline, and then they'll start working those opportunities, then they'll stop prospecting because they're focused on the immediate, right? And then they'll work those deals through the cycle. Some of them they'll win, some of them they'll lose. But one Monday morning, they're going to come to the office and there's going to be nothing to work on because they've stopped prospecting, right? So I think if you know what level of activities you have to do throughout the sales cycle, so not every day, but let's say you have a 3-month sales cycle. If we look at it at a very high level, what do you have to do as a salesperson? You have to find the prospect, you have to engage them, you have to sell them, and then you have to manage the account to maintain the customer, right?
Yeah.
So if you looked at time, how much time do you have to allocate to each of those activities, right? So that will vary from person to person.
Yeah.
But if I know that Tibor needs to have 20% of his time for prospecting, 30% selling, 20% for account management, I can begin to either on my own or with the help of a manager, maintain that level of activity, which then maintains a steady pipeline.
Yeah. One of the biggest questions I see a lot of people having this question is, how do I attract and retain best salespeople?
So I think there's a couple, and I think this answer will vary based on the nature of the company, because I think it's very different if you're a younger company or a smaller company versus, mid-size or enterprise or what have you. I think in mid-size and enterprise, it's quite simple. I think that people want to work in an environment where they could win. So if you can create an environment that is known to be a winner, then you will be attracting the right salespeople. If you create an environment where people understand that they could just get by and coast, then that's the kind of people that you're going to attract. So I think that if some of the larger companies that I've worked with, they've really put a focus on what I call quote unquote sales culture. And what really they benefit from is two ways. One is having that sales culture helps them develop and really maximize the performance of their current salespeople, but they also attract salespeople. It used to be in the old days everybody wanted to work for Xerox. These days, everybody wants to work for Salesforce. So there's always these different companies, and if you think about it, it's not the money, because you can make money anywhere if you're a good salesperson, right? But there was a prestige to selling for IBM, right? There's a prestige for working for certain companies, and I think smart salespeople, ones who are consistently performing, realize that they have the skills and the means with which to get those prestige type of jobs. I think where the question becomes more relevant is as you get into smaller companies, because there's a tendency there for owners to want to hire people who are like them. So if you think about a startup, or if you think about an owner, a lot of times they get a great idea, they have a new idea, and they sell a lot of the first few customers based on enthusiasm. Nobody knows the product better. They built it in their garage, they developed it, they took it to market, they got the financing to put it out there. So their heart and soul is in it. Nobody is going to talk better about that product than them. So they go out and they find what somebody that they feel comfortable talking to, but since at heart they're a product person, not a salesperson, they end up hiring a product guy, a guy that sounds like them, a guy that they can have a good conversation with. So the problem, but the problem is that guy's not going to be able to sell because he's a product guy, right? So one of the challenges that I would put out to business owners or startup people is, if you're going to hire a salesperson, hire the guy that you really don't want calling you, because that's the guy that's going to do best for you. You're not hiring a product guy. You're hiring a guy that can get through to a potential customer. So think about the guy you don't want calling you and hire him.
Interesting. I guess this is part of a related question in one of our past conversations I've had with you. How do you ask a customer what keeps you up at night without specifically asking them what keeps you up at night?
I think it's up to us to do the work in advance, right? So one of the things that I'm a big proponent of is to make sure that every deal that goes through your pipeline, whether you win or you lose or they don't make a decision, that you know exactly why the outcome was that it was. So as a result of that, what I suggest to customers is that they go back, even if they lost the deal, say, you know what, we understand we're not looking for you to change your mind, but we have a few questions that will help us make sure that next time around we meet your expectations. So what you begin to realize is what it is that they were trying to achieve, and not so much which product features they were looking for, but what those features enable, right? So are they going to be able to export to more markets as a result of that? Are they going to be able to reduce the cost of their shipping, meaning that they can, attract more customers? So what's that really that end goal? So I think if you know that, then you can ask customers questions along those lines. I'll give you an example in my world. So it's hard to ask people how good their forecasting is without them getting defensive, right? Because if their forecasting is really good, they have a right to be arrogant about it. But if their forecasting is somewhat weak, we're all going to be defensive. So the way that I would do it is I say, George, I read this article a while ago in Selling Power, and they were talking about the fact that only about 53% of B2B sales forecasts are accurate. And you just stop there and they start commenting on it. And just the way that they respond to that leads to the conversation about where their forecasting is. And I'll give you an example. The company shall remain nameless, but he was convinced that his forecasts are 80% accurate. And that blew me away. Like, think about that would be a machine, right? Well, it turned out that they weren't forecasting anything until it was verbal. So by that time, 80%, yeah, that's safe, So 80% of a customer said, yeah, send me the paperwork, So I said to them, then if that's the case, then you're really not doing well, because if they're giving you a verbal, why are you losing 20%? So
Very good. This is funny. Your methodology is fun, interesting because one of the best sales coaches I know is a guy called Richard
Other
Bandler.
than me?
Other than you, is Richard Bandler. He's the co-founder of NLP,
Right.
programming. So he wrote a book called Sales Persuasion, which I thought was really funny. But throughout the book, he keeps talking about reading this other book. Like he's in a plane, he keeps reading this book. He's in a plane, he keeps reading the book, and keeps reminding about all these insights. Without me thinking, I also went and bought the other book just because I really like some of his techniques. And I realized that the book that he was keep referring to that he's reading is a book that he wrote himself.
Yeah. But again, what you're looking to do is start conversation, and you want to give people a safe ground. I'll give you another example. Like my prospecting program, you know, unless the guy called you and said, I need a prospecting program, it's hard to go in there and say, hey, do your people suck? You can't really say that, right? So what I do is a simple thing. I ask them, how much of your revenue comes from existing customers versus brand new customers? And they'll say something like, 10% from new, 90% from existing. And I'll go, so I'm curious, in your 2019 sales plan, what did you have? And it's always a different number, right? It's always like 80-20. Well, they've just put a gap on the table, right? So now I can talk about the gap. How do you plan? What do you attribute that to? Like, why is that discrepancy? You thought you could do 20%, you're only doing 10. But I'm not saying that, but I'm leading to that conversation. By getting him to put the gap on the table, I could say, really, so what do you attribute it to? I don't have to be accusatory. I don't have to be negative. I let him talk, I think we talked about this before, that my best sales call, it's more psychotherapy than it is, sales. It's just giving them a chance to talk and think about what they've been wanting to think about.
That's so true. That's so true. There are lots of go-to-market plans, strategies, but what's the best way for prospecting?
The best way to prospect?
Yeah.
So I keep talking about this concept called the expanding toolkit. Most people want to look for one, maybe two, quote unquote, the perfect tool, as it were, right? The silver bullet. The one thing I had a big disagreement about my co-author with my book is on the cover, he says that there is a silver bullet in sales, and I don't think there is. And frankly, unless you're hunting werewolves, you really don't need a silver bullet. But so trying to think how to best phrase it. People are different. So your modality is different than mine. Some days I'm more apt to talk on the phone. Some days I'm more apt to be on email. Some days I ignore everything. I just look at my LinkedIn and so on. So I think people are taking a big risk betting on one type of approach to prospecting. So I think that the more inclusive you are. So I'm a big believer in cold calling, and I won't walk away from that. And recently I saw stats that showed that if you use LinkedIn, email, and telephone, your chances increase dramatically. So if you take the telephone out, the only one you're hurting is yourself, right? So, but a lot of people will, because they're afraid of the phone somehow, like it's going to bite them or something. So I believe in the expanding toolkit. A few years ago, and it's going to sound odd, but about 8 years ago, I wrote a piece about how to use text messaging for prospecting, and salespeople were biting my head off. How can you suggest that, and da 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 da? And like, why would I make a judgment as to what mode of communication my customer chooses? I'm going to try all of them, because if I choose the wrong one, I'm never going to talk to him, right? But if I choose text and snail mail and telephone and LinkedIn and email and other social media, I'm definitely going to find a way to connect with the individual. Yeah, so to answer your question, the best way is the most expansive way.
Very cool. Fair. So in my business, I use AI to find lookalikes. And I've got an algorithm that helps me find customers that have a 90% chance of converting fast.
You need to share that with me.
Absolutely. So yesterday I called a guy in Ottawa who runs a SaaS software, and I said to him, and he's the CEO of the company, and I said, my AI told me I should call you. I do lead generation using artificial intelligence, and I'm kind of drinking my own Kool-Aid. So we got into our conversation, and he says to me, the challenge that I've had with sales consultants, demand generation consultants, is hit and miss. And I asked him to tell me why is it hit and miss from his experience and how AI is different. Or then I have to explain to him how AI is different. It's not hit and miss. But what he said to me was what you just said. Now I can understand a lot of companies use email, for instance, but they don't use phone. Or they write content and blogs and whatever else they think they should be doing, but they don't do the other thing, if that makes sense. And I think one of the biggest challenges I feel, I could be wrong here, I feel is that they're also recruiting a much younger workforce. That's not, the younger workforce generally speaking, they don't want to do cold calling. Right? And generally speaking, they don't have a lot of friends that business could use. I wrote a book, Hypergrowth, How to Connect to Customers in New Ways. And I interviewed 470 CEOs in Canada. 470. From Peter Ciceri, the ex-CEO of Compaq, down to whoever else. One guy I thought was brilliant. He was a past president of Rogers. He's now the CEO of a data center in Montreal. His sales strategy was, I thought, fascinating. He keeps hiring people as in, hey, Tibor, I want to hire you for whatever time, like as a sales rep. But what he was expecting you to do was open your network, work your network, and then he would know that by a certain time, let's say 3 months out, 6 months out, a year out, your network would die. And then after that, he would let you go because you're not making any sales calls. And then he would bring the next guy in. And I thought, interesting concept of using word of mouth advertising, hiring people just for the network and then letting them go, hiring people for the network and letting them go. I didn't write a in my book. Sorry.
In life insurance, it was like that for years, but intentionally. They knew that if they hire somebody, the first thing they would do is call friends and family and sell them the policies.
Yeah.
Because that way they would be able to sustain a living for a few months. But the difference is that they would self-eliminate after they've sold a policy to everybody in their network. They couldn't make an income, or most couldn't make an income, so they left. But the insurance company maintained the policy.
Interesting. Listen, I know time is tight, but I do want to do a sales pitch on your behalf.
Sure.
To my database. Given that I don't have any financial arrangements, agreements with you, nor am I interested in, because I'm an independent AI lead generation guy, I do want to make a sales pitch on your behalf. I believe 30, 40 years ago, companies like Xerox and IBM, the two market leaders, were spending a lot of money on sales training. And some of the best CEOs today that I know, and I can name a whole bunch of them, come from IBM, come from Xerox because of that sales training they've had. And people would steal from IBM and Xerox because they knew that the resources they were stealing were trained. And that budget's now, trained development budgets, as far as I can see, has now disappeared in a lot of companies. And so now what I believe is the access to that growth plan is for companies to hire people like you, Theodore, who've got that experience, who have that, I'm going to use the wrong words here, who have the white hair. I
got the white hair.
Right?
Yeah.
Have the white hair and can produce something remarkable. So that's my sales pitch for you, if I may. Now tell me, if my audience was to get hold of you, how do they get hold of you?
Well, I think the easiest way is if they go to tiborshanto.com. So that's TIBORSHANTO.com. Or if they can't wait, they can call me at 416-822-7781.
Awesome. And then if I was a salesperson selling you something, now we can experiment with this. Website and phone call.
Yeah, why not?
Thanks so much for giving your time to my audience. I really appreciate it.